We've covered the relationships of series, progression, alternative, action, manner, comparison, negative, positive, idea, explanation, question and answer, ground, and inference. And I want to give you now some more examples of how do we come to a text, and using these relationships that we now have in our back pocket, how do we arc a more complex passage? Because arcing in itself, and you've seen this in some of the examples that I've given, that arcing in itself is fairly simple once you understand the relationships. However, following a flow of thought in the text is complex. So let's look at this example here of Matthew chapter 7, verses 13 and 14. Jesus says, "Enter by the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the way is easy that leads to destruction. And those who enter by it are many. For the gate is narrow and the way is hard that leads to life, and those who find it are few." So now that we've defined our text and we read over the text, let's begin to break down this text into its individual propositions. I see in the first sentence there is one proposition: enter by the narrow gate, period. There's one verbal assertion, and then so that gives us our first proposition. We run into a key word here, for, which seems to signal the relationship of ground, and we'll see how that bears out as we go through this passage. And so a second proposition: the gate is wide. The gate is wide. And a key word possibly pointing us to the relationship of series or progression. We'll see as we go through this, the gate is wide and the way is easy that leads to destruction, comma, and another proposition: those who enter by it are many, period. For, another key word to keep in mind: the gate is narrow and the way is hard that leads to life, comma, and those who find it are few. So let's write this out according to the propositions that we've identified here. Jesus says, enter by the narrow gate, period. For the gate is wide and the way is easy that leads to destruction, comma, and those who enter by it are many, period. For the gate is wide. No, the gate here is wide. The gate here is narrow. And the way is hard that leads to life, comma, and those who find it are few, period. So we have these propositions. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 propositions. Let's label these propositions. Verse 13 it begins here, 13, and verse 14 begins with 4. So we'll label these 13A, B, C, D, 14A, B, and C. We'll draw a line, and we'll draw an arc over each proposition so that we can begin to ask, what is the relationship between each proposition? Okay, so let's begin to identify the relationships between these propositions. We see first that we have a proposition contained within this first sentence, enter by the narrow gate, and then we see the word for in the second proposition. So we have probably a ground or a reason for this exhortation. The ground on which, the foundation on which this exhortation rests. For, and then this sentence contains 3 propositions. So we want to arc the relationship between these 3 propositions before relating back to 13a or moving on to 14. And these 3 propositions are joined by these keywords, and. The gate is wide, and the way is easy, and those who enter by it are many. So we probably have either a series or a progression here, and I think that the progression would be appropriate. You could, if you were arcing this out, you could arc this either way that you'd want to, but I'm going to arc this as a progression because there seems to be a stair step, a cumulative effect of these propositions. The gate is wide, and the way is easy, and those who enter it are many. This seems to be Jesus' emphasis here. So I'm going to label this as a progression between these 3 propositions and draw one arc over the top. And then we see something similar in verse 14. The gate is narrow and the way is hard. There's a parallelism between 13 and 14. The gate is narrow and the way is hard, and those who find it are few. And so I'm going to label this similarly as a progression within this sentence. And so then we have something interesting that's happening because we have 2 sets of progressions. Here in 13b through D and in 14a through C, we have 2 sets of progressions that both seem to exist as reasons for this exhortation. And they seem to equally weight these reasons for the exhortation that Jesus is giving to enter the narrow gate. Because the gate is wide and many find it, and the gate to life is narrow and there are few who find it. And so these 2 things, B through D and A through C, seem to me to exist in series to each other, and both of them are the reason, the ground underneath the exhortation that Jesus is giving. Enter by the narrow gate, for the gate is wide. Enter by the narrow gate, for the gate is narrow that leads to life. So he's offering these two progressions to illustrate the difference in trajectory and inviting his listeners to enter by the narrow gate. So this passage then we can see really has one exhortation followed by 2 sets of reasons that each progress, one to destruction of the many and one to life of the few. And this is the ground on which this exhortation rests. So this is an example of arcing Matthew chapter 7, verses 13 to 14.